Hi everyone, today I'm going to sketch this jar of honey that I bought from the hill tribe villagers in the mountains of Chiang Mai, Thailand. Supplies for today: I've got a 2B pencil for sketching, an eraser, a silver black velvet round brush size 8, Pigma Micron permanent liner pen size 0.5, cotton watercolor paper round about A4 size, tissue paper, palette of paints, water, spray bottle, and a palette for mixing. I'm going to start with my pencil sketch already on the page, and I'm going to go into working with my Pigma Micron size 0.5 permanent liner pen now. My apologies for not showing the pencil sketching stage. I didn't realize that the camera shut off after 10 seconds of filming, so I don't actually have it recorded. If you wish to sketch the pencil sketch along with me, then do whatever I'm doing in ink in pencil and then go over it in ink after. Alternatively, if you would like to trace or copy my sketch, there is a link to the free downloadable and traceable pencil sketch for this in the description box below. If you're following along in ink with me, then you will see that I'm trying to keep my lines a little bit irregular as I'm sketching. I don't draw long continuous lines, but I leave little gaps between the lines here and there. Although this is going to be quite an accurate sketch and have a little bit more detail and layers than a normal travel sketch might do, I still think that the sketch needs a little bit of space to breathe, and that is why I'm making my lines non-continuous. I've decided that I want to try and get a little bit of the honeycomb lattice sketched in, and that's going to be a little bit tricky. I'm going to start by sketching some pencil lines just so that I can get myself some guidelines as to where I think the rows of hexagons are going to go. Once I've got the guideline for the rows down, I'm going to then use my pen and just try and sketch in very lightly the approximate rows of the hexagons as best I can. I'm not going to do solid edges everywhere, just a suggestion of the hexagon shapes throughout the honeycomb. As I said, this honey was bought from the hill tribe villagers in the hills of Chiang Mai, Thailand. If you take a drive up the highest mountain in Thailand, which is called Doi Intanon, you get the opportunity to meet some of these hill tribe folk and also to pass by some of the street side vending stalls that they have on the way up the mountain. This honey is harvested by the local hill tribe people and is absolutely delicious. Once I'm sure that the ink is completely dry, I will erase the pencil lines to prepare for the painting layer. Before I start painting, I want to just emphasize the edges of the sketch. So the edge of the lid and the edge of the bottle, I'm just going to go over one more time and just make the lines a little bit darker. This is one of the stops that we made that day, to one of the hill tribe villages up Doi Intanon. The hill tribes are well known for their amazing weaving skills, and most of the fabric that you find in and from this area is still made using these traditional looms. This weaving is a skill that is still being passed down from generation to generation. I have seen young women working the looms as well as old. And from my discussions with these women, this is an immensely time-consuming process. One young lady I spoke to once says that it takes about 2 days to weave 1 meter of fabric. This is the big roadside vending area that you will find about halfway up Doi Intanon. I love this place. It is just a burst of colors, smells, and flavors. There is so much on sale here. Vibrantly colored fresh fruit and vegetables, dried fruit, nuts, fruit wine, honey, and clothing and goods made from local fabrics. I always come away from here fully laden with all sorts of tasty treats. This is where I bought the jar of honey that we are sketching today. If you have a look on the photograph, you will see that on the bottle there are some distinctly white highlighted areas on the jar. There's different ways that I could tackle this. I could just paint the entire bottle without considering the highlights and put the highlights in with something like white gouache at the end. Alternatively, I could try and be aware of them whilst I'm working through the sketch and avoid them throughout the sketch so that I don't have to cover them over at the end. I'm not sure which is the best method to use here, but today I've decided that I'm going to use a pencil to mark out the highlights early on and avoid them throughout the sketch if I can. So using the photograph as the reference, I'm going to look for those highlight areas on the right hand side of the bottle, on the lid, and a little one on the top left of the bottle, and mark them out with pencil. I'm going to activate my paints by spraying them with a water spray bottle. And then if I look at the highlight area on the photograph, I can see that the highlight is not completely white, that it is pulling in a little bit of blue from the sky outside. So I'm going to use lavender on the highlight areas first. I will mix the lavender to a very weak consistency so that it's not very dark at all, and lay it down onto the highlight areas. This is a sketch that I'm going to do that is going to involve quite a few layers, more so than a basic travel sketch normally would do. With that in mind, I'm going to start with the base layer on the lid of the jar, and I'm going to mix up a very weak consistency of the perfect color on my palette, which is rich green gold. If you don't have this exact same color, then something like a muted down lime green or something would be absolutely fine. I'm going to work wet and wet, so I wet the entire lid with clean water first and then make up a very weak consistency mix of the rich green gold and put that in over the whole lid. I'm going to make sure that I avoid the area that I penciled out as a highlight. But once I've done that, I'm just going to put a pretty even mix of the very light wash of the rich green gold over the whole surface of the lid. I'm not looking for any major variations in color or consistency at this stage. That'll come into my further layers. But once I've got the first lighter layer down, I'm going to, whilst the paper is still a little bit wet, put a little bit of a darker area around the edge. And whilst I've got the slightly thicker consistency on my brush, I will look for a few of the medium tone areas on the top of the lid as well and drop those in. As I said, we are going to do multiple layers to try and get a three-dimensional and realistic look to the sketch. But if it's possible within any given layer to add a little bit more variation in tone, I will do so. Then I'm going to clean off and wipe my brush a little bit and use this to then lift up some of the lighter areas around the lid. Using a clean, dryish brush really does help to lift the paint out of the areas where you're wanting to retain the highlights. Now, in a last effort to increase the contrast as much as I can even in this first layer, whilst there's still a bit of moisture left in this layer and it's not completely dry, I'm going to add the thicker consistency of the rich green gold into the darkest areas on the lid. I want to work wet and wet in the honey layer as well, and I also want to give myself as much time as possible to move the colors around. So in order to do that, I'm going to put down quite a lot of water as a base layer and then work into that, just making sure to avoid the highlight areas again. Now I'm going to work from light to dark in this honey layer. I'm going to focus my attention first on the lightest yellow areas that are catching the light inside the honey, particularly on the bottom left and then throughout the honey. I'm going to mix up Hunter yellow light into a weak consistency and drop that into the areas that I can see the yellow color throughout. I will put the yellow down in a light consistency first, but you can see that it does mix quite a lot because of the water that I've laid down. Once I've done it, the initial layer, I will then drop in some thicker consistencies into the brightest areas. Now I need to mix up the color for the honey itself. I've got the perfect color in my palette that I think will match this honey, and that is quinacridone sienna. I have this color thanks to my friend Lillian, who gave me some. She inherited it from a family member who passed away. It's not a very common color, and it's doubtful that you'll probably have this in your palette. So if you don't, then try and mix up something as close as you can, probably mixing together some oranges, dark yellows, and maybe a little bit of browns or burnt sienna. I'm going to drop this color in a very weak consistency in my water layer, avoiding the yellow areas that I've already laid down, as well as the lavender highlight areas. I'm going to work on adding a bit of depth to this first layer whilst it's still wet, and to do that I'm going to drop in some burnt sienna into the areas that are darkest, in the center and around the bottom. This is still just my first layer that I'm going to build up on in later layers, but I'm still going to use the opportunity to drop in thicker consistencies into the darker areas whilst I can. I want to start separating the honeycomb from the honey a little bit, so the burnt sienna I will drop in around the honeycomb, but avoid it for now. Using this layering style that we're going to be using for this sketch, you've just got to have patience because the water layer will cause the colors to blend. They also do end up drying lighter. So you've just got to make the most of each layer that you lay down, and whilst it's still wet, to do with it the best that you can. I'm going to just keep on dotting in with this medium consistency on my brush to increase the intensity of this burnt sienna color. I'm happy with how the honey is looking for the first layer, and now I'm going to work on the honeycomb. I also want to get a little bit of texture and difference in color here. So to do that, I'm going to work with a medium consistency of the burnt sienna and just dot it in throughout the honeycomb to try and get some shadow areas. These sketches that have multiple layers require a lot of patience whilst the layers dry. Whilst this first layer dries, I thought I might show you a bit of the hike that we took whilst going up Doi Internon. This is our guide Maxine, and we are hiking the Padok Siew nature trail. The entrance to this trail can be found on the left-hand side of the road, about halfway up Doi Intanon. The trail may only be walked with a local guide, for which you pay a nominal fee at the entrance. This is done to ensure the safety of the forest and its surrounding areas, and I think it's a wonderful way to employ the locals, especially the women, as I haven't seen a male guide yet. Maxine's English was great, and she spotted some interesting plants and insects along the way that we never would have seen had she not pointed them out. The hike takes 2 to 3 hours, and I would say that it is pretty easy in difficulty. The trail is mostly downhill and takes you through forests and past waterfalls, and also through the local flower and rice plantations. The forest is magnificent, and the panoramic views that you keep passing are breathtaking. I cannot recommend this hike enough, and it is easy to incorporate it into a day trip to the top of Doi Intanon from Chiang Mai. Once you get to the village, you are offered locally made coffee from the coffee shop in the village, and after you've had a rest, your guide arranges for you to be driven back up the main road to the start of the trail. Whilst the trail is quite easy, I certainly wouldn't want to do it more than once in a day. But as soon as Maxine delivered us to our car, she went straight onto the trail again with the next bunch of people. She must be really fit. There's 2 things I want to concentrate on in this layer. The first is the highlights. I think that they look a little bit too bright and look a little bit too separate from the sketch as a whole. I want to get the highlights a little bit more integrated into the sketch, and to do that I'm going to do a light glazing layer over them. I'm going to put down water first over the whole sketch, but I'm going to avoid the honeycomb. And once I've got water down, I'm going to go over everything in a very diluted solution of the color that's already on my palette. This glazing layer will tone down the highlights and then just bring the sketch together a bit more as a whole. Once I've done that, I want to separate the honeycomb from the honey a little bit, so I'm going to use a more concentrated mix of burnt sienna. Then I'm going to drop that in around the edge of the honeycomb and allow the color to blend out. I'm going to look on the photograph where the color is the darkest, and that's definitely down the center of the jar as well as the top left. That's where I'm going to concentrate the majority of the burnt sienna that I'm dropping in. And to increase this contrast even more in this layer, I'm going to drop in burnt umber into the mix that I've already got and drop that into the darkest areas as well. This is going to dry a whole lot lighter, so I'm always going to push it as dark as I can in every single layer, but always being conscious of leaving the lightest parts alone in each additional layer and only pushing the darks darker. Now we're going to do the next layer on the lid using rich green gold and using the same principle as with the honey, where I'm just going to put my water down and lay in a darker layer in the areas that are the darkest. I'm going to work the lid section by section so that the color doesn't bleed from one area to the other. So I'm going to work around the rim first, and once I've done that, I'll work in alternating concentric circles on the lid so that I don't have one circle touching the next one that I'm working on. I think I need to talk a little bit about the paper that I'm using because it makes a huge difference to a multi-layered watercolor like this one. For the most part, with a normal travel sketch and a travel sketchbook where you're not doing many layers and not putting a lot of paint on the paper, it matters a little bit less about the paper that you're using. I'm happy in a travel sketchbook to use multimedia paper or a cotton paper that has got a weighting of about 180 GSM because I'm not putting too many layers on the page in a travel sketchbook. But in a sketch like this one, where I am going to put lots of layers, and it is important for the paper to be able to carry a lot of layers, for me, I feel it's imperative that we use a 100% cotton paper that has got a weighting of at least 300 GSM. The paper that I'm using here is my favorite watercolor paper, and that is the brand Baohong. It is a Chinese brand, and it is extremely well priced and is 100% cotton. This is a cold pressed paper, which I like because I do like the more textured nature of the cold pressed paper versus the hot press. Hot press paper is great for things that need micro details like botanical paintings and so on, but I prefer the little bit of unpredictability that you have with the cold pressed paper, where you're not always sure where the paint is going to go because of the high textured nature of the paper. It's important to try both and just see which kind of paper you prefer. But I really wouldn't suggest doing a multi-layered watercolor painting on anything less than 100% cotton paper because I think that you will find it frustrating and that the paper might start pilling up, and also the paper won't handle the multi-layers very well at all. Now I want to work on getting a bit of depth and contrast to the honeycomb layer. I'm going to work wet and wet again, so I'm going to put down a layer of just clean water over the honeycomb, and then I'm going to work with quinacridone burnt orange again and get a medium consistency of that on my brush and then dot it in throughout the honeycomb. I want to get a bit of a glow to the honeycomb layer now, so before this layer dries completely, I'm going to mix up some new gamboge and dot that in around the yellow areas of the honeycomb. I haven't differentiated between the front-facing and side-facing sides of the honeycomb yet. I will do that in a later layer. Now I'm going to work on the rings of the lid that I haven't got to yet in the second layer. I'll work wet and wet again, starting by putting down a water layer first and making sure to avoid the white highlight there that I have left out. Once I've got the water layer down, I'll drop in some thicker consistency in the shadow areas of each ring. Then I want to create a differentiation between the front and side facing sides of the honeycomb. I'm going to work wet and wet and do a glazing layer over the front facing side. I'm going to put water down first and then paint over it with a weak consistency mix of the color that's already in my palette, making sure to not put any water or paints in the right hand light facing side of the honeycomb. And whilst this layer is still damp but not wet, I'm going to drop in some quite thick consistency of the same color into the center of each of the hexagons because I feel that there needs to be a bit more contrast here. From this point on now, the basics are down and it's just going to come down to building layers and increasing contrast. In each consecutive layer, I'm going to keep on trying to push whatever areas of darkness I can see on the photograph. I'm going to try and push them even darker, and at all times leaving the lightest areas of the sketch alone. Otherwise, the whole thing just ends up being too dark. You will see that as I build up contrast and color here, there is going to be a more three-dimensional look to the sketch, as well as it becoming more realistic. I'm going to let some music play now until the sketch is finished because I don't think that there's much more to say, and I'll be using the same colors that I've been using all along.